This video continues our study of sexual selection, but moves from intrasexual selection, which again usually takes the form of male-male competition, and moves to intersexual selection, which usually takes the form of female choice. When you look at some cases of dimorphism between males and females, you see that some traits don't seem to really have any male-male competition function. These traits can be explained from a sexual selection point of view in that they evolved to sway female choice. So, for example, females like fancier peacock tails, the ones with more eye spots. Those are the ones that studies have shown females prefer. In this species, the red-collared widow bird, the females like the males with the longer tails. And it turns out that these long tails are really costly for male widow birds. If you look at just on a daily basis, energetically what it takes them to fly around, it's just a costly trait. So in a study, they took some of the individuals that had comparable tail lengths, and they clipped off part of the tails of certain individuals to see how it affected their body condition. And you see that at the beginning of the breeding season, they have a body index that is a relative measure of how healthy they are. It's kind of a measure of their quality at the beginning of the breeding season and their fat content. Their body condition, in both cases, the shortened group and then the unmanipulated group, was similar. But through time, the stress of the breeding season is getting to both of these groups, and so they're losing their body condition. However, if you look at how steeply that body condition declines in those with the longer tail, you see that it's a much greater cost associated with carrying around this long tail. So why would such a costly trait evolve? Well, it all has to do with mating success. Again, these males in both of these groups started off comparable, but those that had the shortened tail, despite the fact that in the previous year they had a high number of active nests, so they were able to recruit multiple females in their nests, but now females prefer the males that have the long tails. If you cut off the tail, you drastically decrease the mating success of this male because females just no longer find him attractive. Here's another example looking at gray tree frogs. Female gray tree frogs like males that produce longer calls and can produce them more quickly, so faster long calls. And you can readily test this in a laboratory by taking female frogs, put them in a sound chamber, and then put two speakers 180 degrees apart from each other, put the female frog in the middle, and then see which way she hops to which of the speakers. And they tend to go to the loudspeaker associated with the long calls versus the short calls, about a 3-to-1 ratio. They continued this study to say, well, what if we even made it more difficult for the female to get to the long call, and they made it where she would actually have to hop past the short calling speaker to get to the long calling speaker. And so she actually passed the short calling speaker and just was like, oh no, that's not what I'm interested in, and continued on to the long call with comparable numbers. So in both of these examples, why do these traits sway female choice? What is it that females see in these traits? And we've demonstrated that the long tail is costly in the widow bird, and a long, highly repetitive, loud call in a frog could be dangerous too, because it not only is an advertisement to a female, but it could be an advertisement to a potential predator. So if the females are preferring these costly traits, why? Because if they mate with these males and there's a heritable basis for these traits, their sons will also get these costly traits and be sacked with the same costs. So there's several potential explanations for why these costly traits evolve relative to female choice. And I'm going to talk about them in kind of different categories, but realize they're not mutually exclusive. Well, one possibility is that these costly traits, while they themselves are costly, they may be honest signals of the males that have the best genes. So males with the longest tail, the longest, fastest call, they have these traits, and the only reason they can survive with these costly traits is all of their other genes are the highest quality. If you were a low quality male, you probably wouldn't be able to evolve these extreme traits, these costly traits. But even if you were, you probably wouldn't be able to survive with them given their cost. And here's a study of this using the gray tree frogs. One of the cool things about gray tree frogs is the females lay large clutches. So you can take these clutches of eggs and you can divide them into 2 batches. This is looking at comparable female eggs and then seeing the consequence of if you use sperm from a long calling male versus a short calling male in half of the batches each. What's the effect of this on the offspring that are produced? So they produce these tadpoles, and then they raise them in a couple of different environmental circumstances. So one is like a high food situation. So a high food situation, are there differences between the tadpoles when you mated with a long calling male and a short calling male? And then are there differences when you make the same comparison when you raise tadpoles under a low food condition? Now the reason they did this is you might expect that if the tadpoles are getting plenty of food, it really doesn't matter who you mate with. Even a lower quality male, your offspring are going to be fine. But if you really challenge them, if you stress them out by a low food situation, it's really important to get the higher quality genes associated with the long calling male. So here are some of the results of this study. Let me kind of walk you through this figure. So in this column we have the experimental situation where they're raised with high food. Here we have low food. The direction of this arrow depends on whether you have a benefit for the long calling males, or down here if it's pointing down to the short calling males. And in a variety of measure, where there is a significant difference, you see these red arrows. Where it's a blank, that means there wasn't a significant difference between the offspring of long calling males and short calling males. So sometimes it doesn't appear to matter. However, when you do see a significant difference in both the high food situation and the low food situation, you better mate with a long calling male because the offspring have better larval growth in certain years. The time as a tadpole, kind of the developmental rate is better, larval survival, froglet growth. So it's not always the same year to year, but when you do see a difference, it appears that there is an advantage for mating with long calling males. So maybe that's what females are doing. They're picking males with the most extreme traits because there's a genetic benefit of that. They're getting the males that are the highest quality. Are there other things that these extreme traits may be linked to? Well, in some cases, it may be an indication that the higher quality male is also in control of the highest resources. This is a red-winged blackbird, and red-winged blackbirds defend territories in marsh-like habitats along lake shores, and the females, and they're trying to recruit multiple females to nest in their territory. And the male that has the brightest red patches, the best songs, tend to occupy the best territories, and so they're able to recruit multiple females to those territories. So the males, again, with the more extreme traits in this situation, they're signaling some aspect of quality, in this case, their territory quality. Here's an interesting study on hanging flies. Hanging flies, their name comes from the fact that they hang from vegetation during the copulation process. What males do is they'll go catch an insect, so they're predators. They catch an insect. They'll hang in a location to recruit a female to mate. And there's a correlation between mating duration and the size of the nuptial prey. So a nuptial gift, again, is a food gift given in exchange for mating. And so the size of this nuptial gift, to a point, is correlated with copulation duration. And that's what's seen here in nature. So the larger the nuptial prey, up to this point right here, you get more matings. But what's going on here? Why is this suddenly level out? It could be a situation that doesn't matter. The bigger it gets, it doesn't matter to a female. But really what's going on can be dissected when you look at them mating in a laboratory. Here is a graph showing the duration of copulation with the amount of sperm that's transferred. And we have a nice linear relationship up to about 20 minutes. And at 20 minutes, there's no more sperm transferred. Basically, this is because the female reproductive tract is full. Well, let's see how that compares to what we're seeing in nature. As you can see here, at 20 minutes, that's where we see the leveling off of copulation. That's exactly what you'd expect here. So what's going on, larger prey items, the female snail may want to feed on those, But the male basically yanks it back and says, okay, thanks, we're done here, and he tries to recruit additional females to mate with. So bigger is better, more brightly colored is better, longer is better. What is it about extreme traits that make it where the female should prefer them? I mean, why is it that those are linked to better resources or better genes? The key is these traits are honest signals of quality because of the fact that they are extreme. The high cost of these traits keep them as honest signals. A low-quality individual that doesn't have good genes can't produce long calls. It can't repeat calls quickly. It can't grow a long tail, or if it did, it wouldn't be able to sustain that for long periods of time because of the energetic cost associated with that. So an extreme trait, the extremeness of the trait and its linkage to it being costly is what makes that trait an honest signal, and so that's why females pay attention to it. They see the males with the more extreme traits as the highest quality individuals or the individuals with the highest resource potential. And again, when we go back to the basic understanding of why males and females have different reproductive tactics to maximize their fitness, the females are going after quality. So some studies have indicated that the evolution of specific traits may not be at random. Males may be more likely to evolve certain sexually selected traits to get the female's attention if the females have a sensory bias. So we call this the sensory exploitation hypothesis. So here's an example of water mites to do this, but before I get into that, let me just give you another example. There are certain cases where an insect or a bird might have a preference, females may have a preference for a certain food color, and so they have a sensory perception of that that's very well defined. If males then evolve some kind of trait that is also that similar color that the females are already sensitive to, it may be a better way to get their attention. Okay, so let's talk about this example with water mites. Both male and female water mites have this specific behavior called the net stance when they're hunting for prey. Basically what they do is they sit on underwater vegetation with their front appendages in kind of a ready to attack mode. And they're trying to feel for vibrations as these prey swim by. Well, in some species, males will mimic the trembling display of the prey in front of the female to get her attention. And when he does get her attention, he puts out a spermatophore that then the female grabs if she's ready to mate with him. So this appears to be a good example of sensory exploitation. The male is taking advantage of a sensory sensitivity that a female has pre-evolved in a different context. So how do you test this? Well, here's using a comparative method to do that. If you look at different species and their phylogeny, and you look at the presence of whether the female uses a net stance in its hunting, and then whether males use a tremble display during courtship, these boxes indicate the presence or absence of each of these behaviors. Now, if you map that onto a phylogeny, we're going to use what's called the principle of parsimony to look at the likely pattern of evolution. Given that all of these green boxes are representative of species in this clade, I mean, we could say that this species, this species, this species, all of them independently evolved in net stance. That didn't make a lot of sense, right? That's not what we call a parsimonious solution, the simplest possible evolutionary explanation. The most parsimonious solution, or explanation for why all of these have this, is because they got it from their common ancestor. The common ancestor from which all of these species eventually are derived, that common ancestor gained the net stance here, and they just all have it because they get that from their common ancestor. Well, let's use the same logic to figure out the possible evolution of the male tremble display. Here it gets a little more complicated. One possible explanation is that it evolved in the same common ancestor and then was just lost in this species. So that takes two evolutionary steps. Is this consistent with our hypothesis? Well, it's hard to say. For this to be consistent with sensory exploitation, the net stance had to have evolved first, and then the tremble display evolved later. Well, we don't know within this common ancestor what that order was. It's not saying it didn't happen, but it's not really strong evidence for the male display having evolved where the net stance had previously evolved. But there's another potential evolutionary pattern here. Perhaps no change here in the net stance. That's really the only interpretation that makes sense for this phylogeny. But here, there's the possibility that the tremble display evolved in the common ancestor of all these, and it just didn't evolve in this group until we get to these two. So this lineage right here just never got the tremble display. See, that still takes just 2 evolutionary transitions, 2 independent gains. Here we had an early gain and a loss, so it's still just 2 evolutionary steps. So these interpretations of the male tremble display are what we call equally parsimonious. Which of these, however, is better support for our idea that this is sensory exploitation? This one clearly, because the tremble display evolved 2 times in the context of the net stance having already evolved. How would you tell which of these is more likely to occur? Well, you'd have to have some additional information. So, for example, let's say that you started looking more detailed at the tremble display used by males of each of these species, and you see that all of the species in this group right here have a certain way that they do it that's different from the 2 over here. If that's the case, it may indicate that, yeah, they did evolve independently. They just independently evolved the use of this trait, but they do it in slightly different ways. You may find that over here, that they all do it in a similar way, and that makes sense because they got it from just one common ancestor. So the way I've explained female choice so far, it makes sense from the perspective of the female choosing the highest quality male possible. An early attempt to explain the evolution of female choice traits, however, was called runaway selection. And the idea here is that perhaps females are just kind of robotic, and female preference may really be arbitrary with regard to the quality of the individuals that they're mating with. So the idea here is that the elaboration of a trait gets carried away through a process of what we call runaway selection. Now, to understand how runaway selection could work, we have to think about it evolving in stages. And we have to have certain assumptions about runaway selection. One is that males have, at least in an early stage of the evolution of the display trait, have some genetic variation for this trait. So I'm going to use the example of tail length. So at least early on, males have short tails and long tails. At the same time, females have a genetic preference for a specific trait, and that there's also variation in the population for the female preference. So some females have genes that say, ooh, I like that male with a long tail. Other females have different alleles that prefer short tails. Let's say that early in the evolution of this trait, we don't have as much sexual selection going on as natural selection, such that males with slightly longer tails have greater survival. Maybe it allows them to fly more efficiently, maybe it gives them better control as they're flying through a forest, but whatever, there is a selective advantage to this. Now, think about how that might relate to the females in this population. Remember, some females just prefer males with short tails, some prefer males with long tails. If you're a female that prefers male with short tails, well, you're mating with a male that has a poor trait from a natural selection point of view. It's not a highly adaptable trait. If you're a female that just happens to be robotically attracted to males with longer tails, at this point, you're making a good choice as far as the quality of the male that you're mating with. The result of this is these females are going to pass on the long-tailed genes to their offspring, and so these males, her sons are also going to have long tails, and her daughters are going to have the same genes for the preference for long-tailed males. So we have this linkage between the genetics of the tail length of the males and the preference for long-tailed males in the daughters. And because at least initially this is linked to high fitness, both of these traits are going to become common in the population and maybe even go to fixation, so that the population is maintained by females that only like long-tailed males and males that have this maximum tail length at some degree. So once we get a population where all of the females are preferring long-tailed males and all the males in the population have pretty long tails, let's say we get a mutant male that gets an even longer tail. Well, now this individual is going to have a mating advantage over the other remaining males in the population that used to be considered to have a pretty long tail, but now it's relatively short compared to this new mutation. All of the females are going to want to mate with this new mutant male, and therefore he is going to have really high fitness. She's going to produce sons with these even longer tails, and she's still producing daughters that all of them are going to be producing daughters that have a preference for males with long tails. So we've established a positive feedback situation here. And let's say that this box down here represents that initial figure that I was showing you, so that with increased tail length, you get increased survivorship. All right, so we're just talking about natural selection being linked to female preference at this point. Females really are having genes that allow them to pick males with the highest fitness, the most adaptive tail lengths. But remember, every time we get a mutant male that gets a longer tail, we're going to march up this tail length with additional survival and additional mating success, and that's the key. And eventually we're going to get to the point where we really got the best tail length that maximizes survival. Well, what happens then? If we get another mutant male that's beyond this maximum, let's say over here, they actually don't survive as much as these individuals that have a slightly shorter tail. But remember, all of the females in the population have a preference with males with just the longest tail possible. So he may not live as long, but he's going to have significantly greater reproductive success. So this now is the best trait from a fitness point of view, but not from a natural selection fitness point of view, right? So it's not just focusing on survival anymore. Remember, fitness is really defined as survival linked to the best reproduction, the best ability to pass on your genes. So even if you don't live as long, you're passing on more of your genes than individuals that do have the perfect tail length from an ecological point of view. And we're going to continue to see the evolution of longer and longer tails until it gets to the point where it's just way too costly, so that the decreased survivorship is such that you don't even maybe live to have a high probability of mating. And that's when it's going to stop. So we're really talking about now an intermediate of the optimal, a trade-off between the optimal display for mating. Remember, females just want it as big as possible, but you may have really the optimal display size, a tail size for survival, but you're going to evolve past that to some degree until it gets too costly. So we've got a situation here where we have this positive feedback system between two highly heritable traits, long tails in males and extreme preference for long tails in females. So it's really treating the females like they're robotic. They can't think about this. They just have this preference and they're locked into this mating pattern. Well, what would happen if you had a mutant female that would break this cycle? Let's say that she had a preference for a shorter tailed male. Well, that means she'd be producing sons with a shorter tail. They might actually have better survivorship, but who's going to mate with them? Remember, she's the only female in the population that has this short-tailed male preference. So there aren't going to be any other females in the population that are going to want to mate with her sons. The only way this would work, at least initially, is if there was inbreeding, and the daughters who would also have the short-tailed male genes would want to mate with the short-tailed males. So that would be the limitation for the breakdown of this runaway selection process. All right, let's switch gears. And remember, I told you that the two different categories of sexual selection are intrasexual selection and intersexual selection, and that usually the former is associated with male-male competition and the latter is associated with female choice. We do have the reverse of that situation in some species, so that intrasexual selection is represented by female-female competition and intersexual selection is represented by male choice. This is relatively rare, but it's just a complete role reversal of males and females. So we still see sexual dimorphism differences in behavior between males and females, but it's just the reverse. So this is a jacana, a wading bird that you can see in Central and South America. And in jacana species, the females show the exaggerated traits. The females are larger. The females are more aggressive than the males. And this is linked to a pattern of breeding called polyandry. Females mate with multiple males. So think about that. That means females are going after quantity. And it turns out in this species that the males are very choosy because they have to take care of the nest associated with the female they mate with. That limits their quantity. The males are going after quality. So everything is just reversed. Similar situation in pipefish. Males provide all the parental care. They brood the young in these pouches, and there's limited space for a limited number of eggs, which again limits their ability to maximize fitness through the quantity aspect. So they want to make sure that they mate with a female that is the highest quality. Females, on the other hand, can produce lots of eggs, and so they want to mate with as many males as possible, and so they're trying to convince males to mate. That leads to male choice. Males being picky, females trying to mate with as many males as possible and convince them to take care of her eggs. And females compete for males in two ways. One, they're larger, and so there's some female-female physical competition. But there's also male choice, where males prefer females that are larger and brighter. So here's basically the pattern that we see in the mating success of males, shown up here. And you see that now, instead, remember if we compare this to the newt, this was the biggest column. Most males didn't have any mating success. All males, in this case, are going to have some mating success, and they have a variety of reproductive success. There's some linkage between these, but not a lot. That's a relatively flat line, so that the number of mates you have isn't as important in this species as the quality of the female that you choose. Now let's contrast that to females. This is more like we saw for the male newt. Some females don't get any mating success at all. These are the loser females. But the more mates that they have, there's a pretty tight correlation to the number of offspring they produce. See how steep that line is. So here we have a situation, a role reversal, where we have male choice. Males are being picky, trying to find ways to pick the female that's the highest quality. Females are going after quantity. They want to mate with as many males as possible. So as I mentioned, males are choosy. Here's an experimental study to demonstrate that. Again, they want to mate with the larger females or the females with the more elaborate traits that may indicate good genes and good health. So this is a Y-maze study. So we have males in an aquarium that they can swim on either side of this barrier. This screen prevents these two females over here from being able to see each other and potentially influence each other's behavior. So you can see that here we have a big female, we have a small female. This prevents maybe some potential dominance where this one might swim over here and scare that one and affect its behavior. So that limits the potential female-female competition that could be driving this, because in this study they just wanted to know what was going on with male choice. And so during a trial, what you would do is you would just say, where does this male spend his time? If he hangs out over here a lot, that's indicating, this male really does want to mate with that female. If he hangs out over here more, he wants to mate with this female. If he just kind of swims aimlessly, that's an indication that he doesn't really care. So in this study, what they found is clearly males prefer females of a large body size, and also that the ones that have these larger skin folds, these kind of sexually selected traits that emphasize the size of their body. And it could also be a costly trait to produce those structures. Now here's another species that males are using a different signal to determine which female is the highest quality. Parasites cause these spots on females. And it turned out that in the study, the males would choose, they wanted to mate with the females that had fewer of these spots, indicating that they had fewer parasites. There was an indication they had a lot of parasites. Not many males wanted to mate with those females. So when we talk about traits being linked to good quality genes, there's some models that specifically say that males or females, depending if it's male choice or female choice, they're looking at good quality genes associated with prevention of parasites. So it's called the parasite model. And this fits the parasite model. It looks like the males are really trying to avoid mating with females that have parasites. Well, they did a cool thing in the study, and they said, well, is it really the spots that they're looking at to determine the healthy versus the non-healthy? Or maybe those that have a lot of spots also are just kind of swimming lethargically and they just don't look good. So what they did a cool thing. They gave females these tattoos, spots, artificial ones, that they were all healthy. They didn't have parasites, so their behavior was the same. But some of them had few of these tattoos, some of them had a lot of the tattoos that made it look like they had parasites, and you see the same pattern. The males really were using the spots as a signal to determine how healthy a female was. Sexual dimorphism is also seen in plants. Here are two examples. The top is an orchid with the male flowers on the left, which are brighter in coloration compared to the female flowers on the right. Sometimes this is expressed as a difference in size and coloration as seen in the bottom example. And why is this? Well, if you think about how reproduction in angiosperms occurs, we have to get pollen moved from one flower to another before fertilization can happen. Once pollen leaves a flower, its job is done, and so that takes relatively little investment. The recipient plant, however, has to invest in seed development. So the sexual selection pressure here is for the pollen donors to be better at attracting pollinators, to distribute their pollen so that they can benefit from the aspect of quantity. So here's an example of a study that demonstrated this with wild radishes. There are two different colors of flowers, white flowers and yellow flowers. Now, this is a species of plant in which the flowers themselves have both male and female reproductive capacity. And so it's going to make it a little more difficult to track what's going on here, but I'll walk you through these figures. In this study, it was demonstrated that the pollinators prefer yellow flowers in an experimental study where they had a artificial population setup of 50-50. Now, this doesn't affect the reproductive capacity as far as seed production between white and yellow flowers. The white flowers may not be quite as attractive, but they get enough pollen that they produce just the same number of seeds. But if you look at the pollen distribution, the yellow flowers are fathering more of these seeds. And that's what's being shown here in these data. So the figure on the left is demonstrating that there's a significant preference for yellow flowers. If you look at the maternal function, the seed production, it's at 50-50. There's no difference between white and yellow flowers. But if you look at the paternal function, the ability to attract enough pollinators to distribute your pollen effectively, yellow flowers were much better at doing that. Well, what about in humans? The data are a little mixed on this. There is some example of sexual selection in operating in some populations, but not others. So here we have a study from pre-industrial Finnish individuals in which, depending on whether you consider the class of males or females that don't have any reproduction, the degree of a relationship between reproductive success and number of mates, there's a hint that there's a greater potential here for males. Certainly if you don't consider the zero class for females, it is a straight line, so that's kind of what we'd expect, for example, like the nude example. But there are some women in this population that didn't reproduce, and when you include those, it's really not that much different from the males. Now, if you look in Tanzania, in this population, the number of spouses actually had a negative influence on male reproductive success, and not really a clear pattern with females. So it's not quite as clear in humans in some populations. Other studies have shown some pretty interesting patterns, though. Here's one in which it's shown that male-male competition can be pretty intense. I mean, if you look across populations in general, male-male homicide rates versus female-female homicide rates are considerably different. Males are more violent and more prone to male-male violence. If you look specifically in the Yanomamo culture, 25% of the deaths of males in this population are due to homicide. And it turns out that this actually is adaptive in this population because homicidal men have higher fitness. So if you look They even have a word for this. The unakais, the ones that are homicidal, have more wives, and they also produce more children. So that's strong indication that there is sexual selection pressure operating in this population. Here's another study of a native population in Brazil, the Guarani. 40% of the deaths in this population are due to homicides as well. But in this case, the trend is actually opposite, but it's not really significant. The difference between those that were called zealous warriors versus others, it's not really a significant difference for any warrior age group or interval, and for number of surviving children or number of wives. But where there is a trend, it looks like there's higher fitness associated with the more pacifist individuals. So again, it's kind of a mixed bag. Lastly, here's a cool study in Poland where they looked at different age classes of men and compared them by height and whether they had at least some fitness versus none at all. And the overall pattern for most years was that taller men tend to have children. If you're a shorter male, you tend not to have children. There's one difference though. Men in the age of 50s, there's no difference. But that's actually interesting when you think about when these men were of marrying age. It was coming out of World War II, and the Polish population had experienced a big decline in males in the population. So female choice was just a little restricted in that situation. That probably explains that pattern. So now we've covered both key forms of sexual selection: intersexual selection, which usually takes the form of female choice; intrasexual selection, which usually takes the form of male-male competition. We're going to move on in the next video to examine how individuals living in social groups can affect each other's evolution via social behavior.